A Nightmare on Elm Street is a 1984 slasher horror film directed by Wes Craven and starring Heather Langenkamp, John Saxon, Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger, and Johnny Depp in his first ever film role. And the idea of the film is that this man, this burned man, is haunting the teenagers of Elm Street in their dreams or nightmares. The film focuses on Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp. She tries to survive by not falling asleep, and all of her friends are dying around her for doing just that. Throw in an interesting backstory that's being deliberately hidden from these teenagers who could really use it to survive, and what you get is a very good slasher film. For my reviews for Friday the 13th and Halloween, I have talked about the big three of the slasher genre, and this is the missing link to the ones I've already reviewed. And where the killer in Friday the 13th is fairly similar to John Carpenter's killer in Halloween, Freddy Krueger in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise is very different from those two killers. He's something of a paranormal entity, something not quite as tangible as Jason and Mike Myers are in those other respective franchises. He is something very different. And because the premise of the film is that he haunts these teenagers and kills them in their dream worlds, in their dreams, and that kills them in real life, the premise then allows for a lot more creativity visually than those films do. Another difference is that Freddy Krueger actually likes to toy and play with his victims. In Halloween and Friday the 13th, they're not really like that. They just kill, and that's all they're doing, which can be fine, but this is just a little bit different and a little bit refreshing. It turns the character into someone who's not only obsessed with the idea of death, but also makes him a really sadistic villain. And watching Freddy toy with his targets leading up to the kill is always enjoyable to watch, and also hauntingly taunting. Some great rhyming there. Even though in some scenes the special effects can appear a bit hokey, especially early on. You know, there's a scene where he pops out, does a little smile, cuts off some of his fingers, and it's like, that doesn't look so good. And some scenes where he's going down, he's got the, Robocop thing where his arms are way too long. It's like, that looks a little bit silly, but most of it is done very well. It's a lot more confined and restrained than the later films in this franchise are. But of the first films of these slasher franchises, the first Friday the 13th, the first Halloween, the first Nightmare film, this one has the biggest budget of, the three. It's got a $1.8 million budget, whereas the other ones had less than $1 million, about half that actually. And you can really see where that money went, because some scenes, while some are hokey, others are very, very well done. The first death scene in the film where this girl is being dragged across the roof and being stabbed, and she's bloodying up the walls as she's going up them, defying gravity. It looks real, it looks like it's happening, and because of that, it actually is pretty haunting and pretty psychological, and you can see why some people were absolutely terrified by the Nightmare films back in the day. And there's another scene later on involving a bed and a big amount of blood. I'm not going to say any more for the sake of spoilers, but people who've seen it will know what I'm talking about. During that scene, the way it defies gravity again, and the way they do it, and the way the blood happens, I can't go into detail, I don't want to mess it up for you. Just the way that scene is done, like, you don't see the character die, but you see the result. And that shows simultaneously a degree of restraint, but also a degree of all-out, we're going to make this as good as we can. And that's another thing that makes this first entry into the franchise so good. Often, you don't actually see Freddy kill who they're killing. You see the effects on the outside, so when this girl is being dragged across the roof, you see the scratches appear, but you don't see him doing them because he's doing them in the dream, which is a great way of doing it, I have to admit. It just makes each death scene that bit creepier, and the fact that this all occurs in dreams, in our beds where we have to go every night, it's kind of lost its scare effect now, but back in the day, that must have really, rocked quite a few people to their core. In the same way Paranormal Activity tapped into that, haunting someone in their bed. It's more effective than in the woods, despite that being a creepy setting, because we have to return to our beds every night. If you make that a scary place to go, it can completely ruin some people. But not only does Nightmare on Elm Street have a very unique sort of way of doing things with the dream sequences and the villain in general, a very strong villain, it also has some strong characters alongside that. Heather Langenkamp does a good job as Nancy, and Johnny Depp does a good job as Glenn. They're together in this film, and that's well done. It's not incredible, slasher films don't have the best actors on the planet, but they do a good job, a very suitable one. But where it gets interesting is the fact that the film focuses on Nancy, and she is trying to figure out what's going on. Her friends are dying around her, and she's like, hang on, this happens when we sleep. Who is this guy? All of my friends are having the same dream. I need to figure out what's going on here. And so she has to be an insomniac for the film, because she knows she can't fall asleep. And you see the effects of this on her face, the big bags under her eyes, and she looks like she's been through hell, and she just can't sleep and get away from it. This is the only way to escape, is by physically draining herself. And that's a really good dynamic to have. But something else I like about the film is that the parents don't just disappear like they do in Friday the 13th, and in many respects in Halloween they have that police officer guy, but whatever. Parents don't just disappear, and in fact they actually serve to be kind of antagonists. Without spoiling too much, these parents are deliberately withholding information from Nancy, and that's evident to see, and you just don't know what it is, and it's actually stuff that could really help her, and that comes into fruition later on in the film. But also Heather's mother does stuff like lock her in her room, put bars on the windows, deliberately hide the key from Nancy so she can't escape. She gets in the way of Nancy surviving this journey. And you could look into that, into some subtext about how teenagers feel cooped up by their parents now, they don't understand them. You can do that all you want, that's not where I'm going with it, but it is a very interesting dynamic to have in a slasher film, something that is, to my knowledge, to my memory, the other films in this franchise don't do. Or at least not to the same extent anyway, and most of the problems in A Nightmare on Elm Street feel fairly minor. You know, there's some silly, hokey acting sometimes, but it's suitable, does the job. Some of the effects are fairly hokey, but then other ones are absolutely incredible for the time. The biggest problem, I feel, is the very end of the film, which obviously I'm not going to spoil, but I did some research and apparently the producers saw this as more of a potential franchise, you know, dollar bills. Whereas Wes Craven really wanted it to be a singular experience, you know, completely rounded off and not have any loose ends hanging that would allow for sequels, but the producers put something in, an ending, which allows for sequels, and it kind of feels tacked on, and it kind of reduces the effect of the climax of the film. But again, not going to go into it. It's kind of a nitpick as it occurs right at the end, but it's still an issue. Overall, I give A Nightmare on Elm Street an 8 out of 10. It's worth remembering that as a kid I thoroughly enjoyed this film. I've seen the entire franchise and it's very nostalgic for me. Keep that in mind when you look at the rating, but I've tried to review it as objectively as possible. You know, I really have, but keep it in mind. Take it with a pinch of salt, I guess. But regardless, personally, I love the film. I think it's a great time. I think it's a genuinely good slasher film. Focuses less on the psychological horror and the absolute tension and suspense that Halloween does. That film did it artfully, and it also isn't Friday the 13th and that there's absolutely nothing going for it. It is its own contained experience. It is very different from those films. Feels quite fresh in that regard. I thoroughly enjoy it. I have a great time with it. It's not a must-watch, but a good film. But what did you think of A Nightmare on Elm Street? Do you agree, or do you actually disagree and you think, wow, what are you talking about? This is absolutely rubbish. I hate it. Why is there dream sequences? Blah, blah, blah. Whatever your problems are, comment below. I'd really love to hear what you think. And if you like this video, please like and favourite using the buttons below. You know what to click. But if you really like this video and you'd like to see more, there'll always be more coming. So please subscribe because it helps me so much more than you know. But anyway, thanks again for watching.